So thanks very much. It's really great to be back at Politics and Prose. This terrific crowd. It's bigger than the last one I got. And it's also great to be back in Washington. You know, I used to live just at 4849 Connecticut Avenue, so I know this neighborhood well. And I've lived in this area for quite a while, so it's really, and there's a lot of old friends and colleagues that I've been able to see this week. So I'm going to get right to the book. You know, I wrote this book, The End of History and the Last Man, that was published in 1992, which was about the apparent, growing universalization of liberal democracy around the world. And a lot of people have said, well, now you're writing this book that's pointing in the opposite direction about all the threats to democracy. And one of the things I point out in the preface to this book is that a lot of the people that think I'm simply contradicting myself actually never read the last third of The End of History and the Last Man. That's the part about the last man, which is about life in a stable, prosperous, liberal democracy and what some of the discontents are. And most of the concepts that I use in the New Identity book about the desire for recognition, the fact that some people want equal recognition and others want more, all of those are actually, if you go back to the 1992 book, you'll see that those ideas were developed there. And I said that in many ways, religion and nationalism are both based on this kind of desire for recognition, and they're not going to go away because I was really talking about what the future threats would be. So here we are. Oh, and also, I also mentioned Donald Trump. I actually had forgotten this, but I went back to that last chapter, and what I had said was that in a democracy, you've got to deal with this problem of what I call megalothumia. This is the desire to be recognized as much better than other people. This is a threat in a democracy. The founding fathers understood this. They tried to limit it through a system of constitutional checks and balances. And I said at that time that one of the other things that happens with a capitalist economy is these really ambitious guys can just go make a lot of money and spend their energies that way. And I cited Donald Trump as an example of this. Now, this is before he went bankrupt, in the 1990s and his entertainment career. Little did I know that 25 years or 27 years later, we're stuck with him still, that it wasn't enough I don't know how much money he actually has, but it wasn't enough for him, and he actually needed the kind of political recognition that he's gotten now as president of the United States. A little hard to say that, but here we are. So he's really the reason that I wrote this book. There is there are obvious threats to democracy in the form of a rising China, an authoritarian Russia. The most surprising and the most challenging threats, though, are the ones that are coming from inside democracies, where you have these populist movements that were prominent in 2016 with the election of Trump and with the Brexit vote to get out of the European Union in Britain. And I've really spent the time since then trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Why are these things arising? And one of the arguments that I try to make in the book is that the economic explanation for populism is certainly correct. It's been very well discussed. This has to do with globalization and the fact that the interconnection of the world has led to enormous new wealth being produced, but it has not been distributed evenly. And in particular, working class people in rich countries have been losing income, employment, and opportunities to rising middle classes in developing countries. And so this is one of the triggers for why we're in this particular fix. But the other thing I argue is that there's another cultural side to it, which has to do with identity. And people oftentimes underestimate the power of this. So identity is based on a universal human desire to have one's dignity recognized, right? And if in the book, the first third of it is really how the idea of identity develops through a number of great thinkers like Plato and Rousseau and Hegel and so forth, up to the modern concept, which is different in the following sense, that in the modern world, we have this idea that we have an authentic self that is buried deep inside us. Oftentimes we don't recognize
what that self is, and it fails to be recognized. It fails to get respect from the outside society. And what makes the modern world different is that we expect the outside society to be the people that change, not that inner self. So this isn't just a rebellious teenager that's brought back into obedience. The modern self says, no, I'm right. My authenticity is what's important. And if you, everybody around me, thinks that that's wrong, you're wrong. And you're the ones that are going to have to change. And so it's a very deeply embedded modern idea, and it manifests itself in politics because it is about recognition. It's not just enough to sit there in your bedroom saying, I'm a great guy. If other people don't say it, it doesn't have the same meaning. And it manifests itself in a lot of ways, beginning with democracy, right? So in 2011, this Tunisian vegetable seller, Mohamed Bouazizi, got his vegetable cart confiscated by the authoritarian Ben Ali government. He went to the governor's office. He said, where's my cart? They wouldn't talk to him. They wouldn't give him an answer. So he doused himself with gasoline, set himself on fire, and that was the literal spark of the Arab Spring. The reason it was so resonant is that all of these people living in dictatorial Arab regimes could identify with Mohamed Bouazizi and his story. In that kind of a regime, they don't treat you with the minimum amount of respect that you would expect a human being to receive. At least an answer. If I broke the law, tell me what law I broke. They wouldn't even talk to him. And that, I think, is the basis of the revolution of dignity that broke out a couple years later in Maidan Square in Ukraine, where a lot of young Ukrainians said, we don't want to live in this kleptocratic regime of Viktor Yanukovych that's being dragged into the orbit of Vladimir Putin. We want to be Europeans that have an impersonal modern government that respects its citizens, where you don't have to be an insider to get ahead. So this demand for respect, lies at the core of democracy. Democracies give us respect by giving us rights. We have the right to speech, to associate, to have religious beliefs, and ultimately to participate in politics through voting. That's the way that they treat us as adults that are capable of governing ourselves. At least that's the theory that underlies democracy. An authoritarian regime treats you at best like a child, if you're in Singapore, and at worst as some kind of human trash that the regime can use for its own purposes. So, it's a foundation of democracy. The trouble is that many people are not satisfied by that. They want other forms of recognition that link them to other people, to communities, particularly when those communities have been marginalized. And the first manifestation of this kind of collective identity, was nationalism, which, from the French Revolution, you had both the rights of man, which was the liberal, individualistic version of recognition, but you also had the rise of nationalism, which then goes on to consume the rest of Europe, as all of these countries that are living inside dynastic empires say, no, we Serbs we don't have our own country. We're not being recognized as an independent people. And then, they push for independence, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls apart under these kinds of pressures and so forth. And so the legitimate demand for equal recognition in the case of nationalism evolves very quickly into an aggressive demand to be better than other people and to dominate your neighbors. And that's, what brings us the terrible world wars of the early 20th century. I think a lot of Islamism is also identity-based. A lot of these young guys that go, and grow long beards and take an AK-47 up in Syria, a lot of them are European Muslims who don't feel comfortable with their traditional cultural values, but they also don't feel like they've been accepted in France or in the Netherlands or whatever European society they're living in. And what the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, any of these groups does, is it says, I'll tell you who you are. You're a Muslim. You're part of this great ummah that extends all the way around the world. Muslims are being disrespected, killed, suppressed, and you have the agency to do something about that. So come join our movement. And so it's more that sense of identity and belonging rather than true piety that I think drives a lot of people to become extremists. Now, There's a form of this that has developed in the United States and in Europe and in other developed democracies that is part of our liberalism, or it grew out of our liberalism. But it's evolved in a certain way that I think challenges liberalism in a number of ways. The social movements, these very important social movements that began in the 1960s with the civil rights movement for African Americans, with the feminist movement, with the LGBT movement, movements for the disabled, Native Americans, so on and so forth. All of these groups had been disrespected. They were disregarded, not recognized as having equal dignity by mainstream American society. The white male, Anglo-Protestant dominant elites in the country. And so what they wanted was recognition and also some substantive redress of their socioeconomic position. And that was a very just and important movement. As time went on, the left began to change its composition and its tactics because the left in the United States had been built around the working class. A lot, the majority of whom were white. I mean, in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, that was the biggest part of the New Deal coalition, was white working class voters. As the civil rights movement and these other movements began to unfold, a lot of those working class voters started to defect to the Republican Party. They felt that they were no longer the objects of a lot of social policies and social programs, and they began to, shift over and vote Republican. Now, the way that identity politics, my book is not a book about campus identity. I mean, there's a lot of dumb stuff that happens on university campuses that is related to this, about, do we want to read white male authors and so forth. That, I think that's an issue. I'm not sure how big an issue it is overall, but, there is a certain, real free speech problem that has been produced by a kind of intolerant form of identity politics. But the bigger problem, as I see it, is that to the degree that people see their rights as embedded in their membership in groups rather than them as an individual, you have a problem in a liberal democracy. And especially that's the case if the group is based on fixed characteristics you're simply born with, meaning race, ethnicity, gender orientation, religion. We can't do anything about the way we're born into these groups. And there's some versions of identity politics that assert that the way you're born and those specific experiences then color and shape the way you think about politics and society and culture and sports and, a lot of other things. And I think that kind of runs up against the tenets of a basic liberal democracy in which we say, well, we're actually equal individuals. We don't deserve respect simply because we're members of groups, but because we are human beings that share a kind of universal human agency. The really bad thing, which is why I wrote this book, is that this kind of identity framing has now drifted from the left to the right. And it has, and what we've seen especially in the last couple of years, is the emergence of a right-wing identity politics that is really dragging the country back into an understanding of national identity, that we had in the 19th century that's based on race and ethnicity, which is very bad because we actually live in a very diverse, multicultural society. And if you're going to say only a certain subset of people in the society are the real bearers of national identity, I think you've got a real problem. And unfortunately, we've got a president who I think is a racist and is perfectly happy to foment this kind of resentment and feeling on the part of his supporters. And this is where the cultural part comes in, and this is why I sometimes think that liberals don't quite understand why Trump is popular. Part of it is based on a resentment of political correctness. I mean, people have been wondering why it is that Trump gets away with saying all of these insulting things about disabled people and Mexicans and women and, so on and so forth. And I think the answer to that is that people, people resent the kinds of careful language that, you're required to use in our society, speaking in public, when it has to do with these issues of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. And so finally you get this president who's authentic, right? I said that modern identity is based on authenticity. And this guy, he tweets whatever the hell he's thinking in the morning. And everybody knows that it's not filtered through all these staffers that are trying to vet it for, are we going to insult this group or that group, and so forth. And that's actually part of the reason I think that he came to be appealing. But this is a really bad outcome for our democracy, because you would like democracy, so democracy is pluralistic. We have disagreements, there's never a democracy in which you don't have social cleavages and so forth. But what we want in a democracy is for that cleavage to be over policies, ideas, the way we ought to organize our society. If the cleavages are based on these fixed characteristics, especially things like race and ethnicity, then you're basically turning into the Middle East. I was just in Iraq a couple of weeks ago. If you want to see a country subject to out-of-control identity politics, go there, or go to Syria, or go to Libya, or a country like that, where the tribe or the sect or the ethnic group that you're born in really determines, the way that you align and where you live and, how you relate to other people, and so forth. And that's why, these countries have fallen apart. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen, so forth. They have no larger sense of national identity that binds them together, where you say, yeah, I'm an Afghan, not a Tajik, and my loyalty is primarily to this entity called Afghanistan and not to my, my tribesmen back home. It's a big threat to democracy. I mean, this is something that a lot of people have written about, so I probably don't need to emphasize it. But the specific threat that these populists are posing to democracy is that they claim a kind of charismatic authority because of their direct election by the people, right? So Donald Trump, when he accepted the Republican nomination in 2016, said, I alone understand your problems and I alone can fix them. You really have to go back to, Mussolini or Juan Perón or somebody to find someone using that kind of rhetoric where it's just me alone. I'm the only solution to your problems. And that makes these people anti-institutional. A democracy consists of institutions that limit the power of presidents, of prime ministers, that prevent them from doing whatever the hell they want. And these populists say, well, but the people chose me, and therefore I should be able to carry out the will of the people. And they therefore attack all of the institutions that limit their power, independent media, courts, and we have an example of that right before our eyes, somebody that came into office attacking the intelligence community, now the FBI, the Justice Department, a whole series of American institutions that Americans had thought were part of their democratic system, but simply done in the interest of self-protection for himself and his family. And something similar to that is going on in Poland today, in Hungary, in Turkey, and threatens to take place in a lot of other democracies. So I'm gonna wrap up. We can talk about solutions. I do really have some ideas about what you do about this. You have to wait till the last chapter of the book. The first idea is the following, that, identity is important. So we're all gonna, we're gonna be, black, female, gay, whatever. So there's no question that that's part of who you are in a modern democracy. But you also need to have a sense of national identity that is not that old-fashioned nationalism, something I call civic identity, or civic identity, civic national identity, which is built around ideas. And in the United States, I think that we had gotten to that point in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, where if you asked, what does it mean to be an American? It means, I believe in the Constitution, I believe in the rule of law, I believe in the principle of human equality that's stated in the Declaration of Independence. That's what it means to be an American. It's not that I'm a certain race or ethnicity or I believe in a certain religion. I am an American by virtue of the fact that I share these political beliefs, all right? And by the way, not every democracy has this sense of national identity. So in Europe in particular, there are still a number of democracies, important democracies, that are very good democracies in other respects, but they limit citizenship by ethnicity. And so it's not that easy if you're not part of the dominant ethnic group to be a fully accepted member. But we, I thought had gotten beyond that in the United States, something you need to hold on to. In the immigration debate, I actually think that it's important to think not just about, being open and tolerant and diverse, but you also have to think a little bit about assimilation, meaning assimilation to that civic identity, that liberal civic identity that is capable of accepting a wide, diverse range of people, but still giving them a common set of beliefs. And that's a job that I don't think we've done that well in recent years. We don't teach civics, and we kind of believe, I think this is one of the problems with identity politics in general, that we say, no, all that matters is our particular identity, and we don't really worry about, the larger binding identities that create a democratic community. There's more stuff I could say on things like immigration, because I think that that's really the policy issue that has been driving a lot of voters to vote for populist politicians, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. But that's kind of getting down into the weeds a little bit. So that's basically the argument of the book. It's about this theme that I started back in 1992, that all of us want dignity and respect. You cannot get away from it, but you can shape it. And it can be shaped in very narrow, particularistic ways, or it can be shaped in broad and more universal ways. And I think in order to maintain a democratic political system, it really needs to be something more like the latter. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. Okay, you're first up.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I grabbed it. This is a quick question. You seem to be defining identity politics as based on things that we sort of are born into. It seems like one aspect of identity now that's so important is sort of political identity, partisan,
Yes.
party, liberal versus conservative, and so forth. So those are derived, presumably to some extent, from these more basic born into characteristics. But I don't know,
that's
can
right.
you comment on that? I mean, it seems
Yeah.
like it transcends and it changes all the time.
So, identity is a really flexible concept, and it can apply to individuals, it can apply to groups, and it can apply to groups at different levels. And obviously, the kind of partisan identity that we have developed in this country is very toxic, because that's the basis of, the current polarization, where people don't just disagree over policies, size of government or taxation or something, but they actually hate people on the other side. And they think they're bad people. They don't want their children to marry, people on the other side. Yeah, so it is a form of identity. And I do think it's basically derived from these other, the way that identity has evolved in the manner that I spoke of. A lot of it has to do with geographical location. We've got a big urban-rural divide. It's a divide in terms of education. But you're right, that is a form of it. Sir?
Hello. If most of Trump's base believe in someone and something that doesn't really believe in them, how badly disillusioned do you think they'll be when he finally fails?
Well, this is an important point. So this is something that I and a lot of people wonder, because Trump is extremely unlikely to do the things that he claims he's going to do for the working class, bring back manufacturing jobs, make America great again, build all these things in the United States
Sure.
like we used to 50 years ago. It's not going to happen. But this is where the identity stuff is important, because, people are actually voting against their own self-interest when all of these rural whites in the South that are among the biggest beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act vote for Republican politicians that promise to dismantle it. They are voting against their economic self-interest. Why are they doing it? I think it is over these identity issues, that either it could be the kind of partisan identity that this gentleman talked about, or it could, there's a lot of poisonous ways, so Affordable Care Act was created by this black man, Obama, and we don't want anything, to do with it because that's a policy that was designed for his kind of, so there's lots of ways that people drag identity into these voting choices. How long is this going to last if it's very clear that it's really contrary to their economic interest? I don't know. I don't know. Partly it depends on what is there on the other side that people want to vote for and not just against. So,
Thank you.
Okay, going beyond that gentleman's hypothetical, suppose that Donald Trump is revealed to have committed felonies all over the place, that he's a criminal.
yeah.
Would that lead to a significant dissipation of the identity construct that supports him, or would they just transfer to Grover Norquist or Mark Meadows or Steve Bannon or somebody else and remain intact?
Well, given the way that the Republicans given the way that the Republicans have behaved during this whole Mueller investigation, I think even if he brings felony charges, actually I sort of suspect that that's what we're going to end up with, is sort of like Manafort. There's going to be tax evasion, money laundering, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Given the way the Republicans have been behaving, even if those charges are brought, I'm not sure that he's going to be abandoned by much of the party, at least the ones that are up for re-election. But in a democracy, I think the most serious check is not a judicial check, it's an electoral check. And that means that the election in November and then the one that will occur in 2020 are among the most important elections, in American history. Because if the Republicans hold on to the House and the Senate in November, Trump and the rest of them are going to say, look, the American people don't care. They don't care that he's committed felonies or whatever, because he's doing such a good job in other respects, and the checks and balances then fall apart. On the other hand, if there's a pretty convincing repudiation of Trump, that form of Trumpist, republicanism, then I think the checks will kick in, and a lot of Republicans will say, well, maybe this guy is actually an albatross around our necks, and, maybe we don't want to get so close to him.
Okay, thank you.
Sir.
Thank you for coming back to DC. Appreciate your insight. Just interested in your opinions on political psychology. I know Stanford has a summer institute, and one of their theories of the masses not being polarized, but the elites being polarized and people following one way or the other.
Yeah, that's my colleague, Morris Fiorina, that has argued that in several books over the last, 15 years or so. I think empirically, it's hard to maintain that there's no polarization. I mean, among other things, there's this huge polarization in terms of geographical sorting. And so people's political preferences can be predicted, very accurately by the population density of the place that they live and things of that sort. And that's not something that's an elite-driven phenomenon. That's just people wanting to live near people that are like them in these political ways. So I'm afraid that there is, in fact, a pretty nasty polarization in the society itself, and it may be worse in the elites, and the elites may be driving it, but I don't think that that's all there is to it. Yes.
Yeah, I don't see how you can get away from identity politics in this day and age. And I think it's naive to say that you could say to a black father of a teenage son, remember, that you're part of a great constitution, a great nation that has a history of 200 years, when you're worried that your kid's going to be pulled over by a cop and get killed at night. It seems to me that what's happened is that there has been a breakdown of law and order in our society, that it's favored certain groups. And if I were a politician, I would speak to the different groups that are there, the gays, the lesbians, the blacks, the Hispanics, and I would say, elect me and elect my friends, and maybe over 20 or 30 years, we'll be able to get to the point where you'll have confidence in the institutions.
So take something like Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think that that is a great movement. There's a specific set of police abuses that African Americans have been subject to. It is remediable. You can change that through public policy. And so that movement has focused attention on that and hopefully will actually lead to the changes in police behavior that will reduce that kind of violence. So, of course, that's a good thing. I mean, I don't see how you can argue against it. But it is also possible to argue, as Martin Luther King argued at the beginning of the civil rights movement, that actually what we really want is simply to be treated the way other Americans are treated. We don't want something, we don't want special or different treatment. We want to be part of that American dream. And that, I think is a kind of progressive message that has gotten lost in a lot of the focus on, the specific wrongs and the specific forms of victimization. So I think you can do both. I think you have to do both. I think there needs to be some balance there.
Thank you.
Hi. Compared to American politics to French politics, where the French emphasize on civic nationalism, where it's very controversial to even say African French. It's more, as you see, the ambassador of France has dispute that notion. So I wonder then why France could not integrate with the younger Muslim population. And can I add another one? And another country that is really good with integrating different ethnic groups is Singapore. And Singapore has this housing policies where all of their housings are, like 70% Chinese, 10% Malay, and 5% Indian. So I wonder if the housing situation has to do with all of this thing.
So France is, I talk about France a fair amount in the book. So they got the right idea, right? Coming out of the revolution, they did develop this national identity based on the principles of the revolution, the rights of man, liberty, equality, fraternity. The problem is that they don't make it a reality because there is discrimination in France against, non-white people. And there's also just a huge lack of opportunity because the French economy doesn't produce jobs and, give people a way of advancing. There is also it doesn't get talked about that much in the United States, but the left in France has really shifted from this old emphasis, Marxist emphasis on the proletariat, to an embrace of a certain form of multiculturalism that sees oppression in these cultural terms. And so actually, it is not that kosher for a mainstream politician to support the ideals of the revolution, and it's actually been left to the National Front to be the standard bearers for this kind of civic nationalism. And so that's part of the story of, the evolution of the left there. Singapore, people are always citing Singapore. They do a good job at that. It requires a kind of intrusive, authoritarian state that simply ain't going to happen in this country. Nobody's going to accept being forced to live in an apartment building where the state sets racial quotas, for who lives next to whom. It's just politically, I think, a non-starter here. It's nice they can do it in Singapore, but I think there are very specific conditions that make that possible. Hi.
So you mentioned that part of the problem with identity politics is that essentially it holds that rights are embedded within a group and not within individuals, and that individual rights is the premise of democracy. So once the rights come to be seen as part of a group, it undermines the foundational premise of liberal democracy. But you also said that there's a respect in which this demand for dignity kind of emerged out of the modern world itself, and that, in the modern world, we want sort of society to respect us and we don't want to conform to society. So it seems as if, on your account, the kind of thing that has undermined individualism and sort of the individualistic premise of rights is at least in part a function of this more individualistic culture that we now have in modernity. So my question is, does that imply an indictment of the modern political project? And if not, sort of, does it nonetheless present a challenge, and
No,
how should
so
modernity
it presents,
deal with
yeah,
it?
no, it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I would put it is that we are really grateful that we live in a liberal, individualistic society if we're living in an authoritarian dictatorship.
Right.
But the moment that you can take the democracy for granted, we start to want other things. We want other forms of more particularistic recognition. And that's what's going on in Eastern Europe right now. So, the vast majority of people in Eastern Europe were born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They had no direct personal experience of communism, and therefore they don't really remember what a dictatorship is like. And then they can go on to say, well, actually, the EU is a dictatorship, And I mean, quite honestly, they haven't lived in a real dictatorship, if you can make an assertion like that. But it is this, this real problem with modern liberalism is it's kind of thin gruel. I mean, it's good that we have rights, but a lot of people think that's really not enough to make me happy as a political animal. Yes.
Hi, Professor. I'm a Sci student. I was at your talk
Okay,
yesterday.
good.
Didn't have a chance to ask you this question, so I followed you here.
Stalking me, huh?
I wanted to know how your thoughts on identity kind of fit in with your teacher Huntington's perspective in The Clash, which I was reading recently. Do you think that the proper unit of analysis for international relations is regional identity blocks, or do you think that there's maybe some way in the future we could forge a global identity? Thank you.
Well, I think neither of those. So I actually wrote, for the 25th anniversary of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, I actually wrote an essay about what I thought was wrong and what I thought was right in that, which you can see on the American Interest website. Basically, Huntington, in a certain sense, he was right that these cultural values, these collective cultural values ended up being pretty strong, and in many countries have overwhelmed the liberal universal values. That's this populist, revolution. But he actually believed that these cultures were actually going to amalgamate across national lines into these gigantic blocks. So there'd be a, Islamic bloc and a Western bloc and a Confucian bloc. That is not right. I mean, I think actually the tendency has been the opposite way to, to fracture into these smaller units that are oftentimes subnational. So in that respect, I don't think his concept came to fruition. He was right about a lot of things. I mean, he was right about the continuing salience of religion in modern politics, that religion doesn't go away as a result of modernization. He got some things right, and he also got a number of things wrong. Yes.
Hi. So I studied your end of history theory years ago as a college freshman taking Intro to IR at Tufts. And since so many students have looked at this theory, I'm sure, over the years, I'm wondering what's been kind of the academic response that you've heard, both from students and professors, and has hearing what they had to say caused you to reevaluate the theory at all? Do you still stand firmly by your original ground?
Yeah. So when I first came to Stanford, one of my new colleagues introduced me, and he said, Fukuyama has 50,000 citations if you look in Google Sites and so forth. And I said immediately, yeah, and probably about 95% of those say that I'm wrong. So if you want the fullest answer to that question, you unfortunately have to read this 2-volume set that I wrote before this identity book, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay, because that's basically my effort to rewrite the end of history and the last man based on, what I now understand about the nature of politics. And, there are some major modifications. So the basic part of it, I still believe in. I still believe there is such a thing as history. That is to say, and we don't use that word that much, history with a capital H, the way that Hegel and Marx used it, but we talk about modernization or we talk about development. And those things are really coherent processes. Nobody would mistake living in Guatemala for living in, New York or San Francisco. So modernization has a real meaning. People are voting with their feet in terms of which, kind of society they choose to live in. The political convergence has not been happening. So it's not true that all modern societies seem to inevitably be turning to liberal democracies. The other big modification I would make in the theory is the one that I did in my last book. The title of that was Political Order and Political Decay. And in the original book, I never talked about political decay. History was like a one-way ratchet where you went forward. And now I think it's pretty clear you can go backwards as well. And you need to have a kind of theoretical mechanism to explain why it is you're going backwards. So,
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi. First, thank you for coming to speak here. I thoroughly enjoyed Political Order and Political Decay, and they were not assigned to me.
The current book is a lot shorter, so you won't require.
Today, the New York Times came out with a new map detailing Facebook data and connections across the country, and it really visualized how isolated certain parts of the United States are from others. One of the big takeaways, at least in the article, was that it was more of an economic divide between those who are more affluent and had more connections and more rural areas. And it also highlighted older patterns of migration. I was curious if you had any comments on that in relation to the work.
No, that's basically true. I mean, I think one of the biggest correlates with who voted for Trump is actually population density. But the population density also correlates with other cultural values. So the voters that live in areas like that tend to be, socially more conservative. They're more religious. They have more traditional kinds of values about the family and so forth. They tend to own more guns. There's a lot of things that get stirred into that mix. And so it's not simply the case. So I guess this is the way, this is my explanation for why this identity issue is important. If you look at simply the incomes of the people that voted for either Clinton or Trump last election, you're not going to explain, more than about half of the voting, because the average Trump voter actually had a higher median income than the United States as a whole. There are a lot of, pretty well-to-do Americans that were not losing jobs in factories that voted for Trump. And conversely, there's a lot of, pretty diverse people that ended up voting for Clinton. And as we were discussing with one of the previous questions, in many cases, a lot of the Trump voters were simply not voting their economic self-interest. They were voting for policies that would end up hurting them in the long run. So that could just be a cognitive problem. They don't understand what reality is. Or it could be that there are just other things that are more important to them than their economic status. You saw that in Britain with the Brexit vote, because a lot of the Leave voters, when they were, so the Remain voters all said, oh, it's going to be an economic disaster if we leave the EU. We're going to lose jobs, the City of London will collapse, all these horrible things will happen, which is actually probably going to be true. And a lot of Brexit voters said, I don't care. If that's the price we have to pay for preventing our country from filling up with all these foreigners, I'm willing to pay it, right? So that was a case of basically a cultural or an identity demand overpowering, economic self-interest. And so I just think that, you got to look beyond, simply those economic factors if you really want to understand why people are voting the way they're voting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thanks for coming out. So you mentioned that ideas-based political identities could overcome tribally based identities. However, it seems presently that the political left is completely unable to unify and effectively resist Trump, largely due to the fact that there are so many identities represented by it. So could you speak more on how exactly political ideas can mobilize a pluralistic movement in the age of identity politics?
Well, that's what that's the function of political leadership, is that you try to distill certain ideas that are broadly appealing and then present them, communicate them in an effective way. And I think that could still be done. There's a much more specific strategic challenge that the Democrats have, I think, not so much in the November election, but they're going to have this big time when we get to 2020, which is, do you want to double down on the existing identity groups and, appeal to those, all those separate groups in their narrow terms, or do you want to try to win back some of those white voters that defected to the Republican Party in the last election and in previous elections? You can win an election doing the first, if you simply appeal to the identity groups, because all of the activists in the party live in those groups, and they're the ones that are going to be, ringing doorbells and so forth. And so it's a very appealing strategy, for the tacticians to undertake. But I think that in the longer run, it's not a good formula for governing the country. I don't think it would be good if the Republican Party, comes to be seen as the white people's party, and the Democratic Party is seen as the party of all the others, all the other minorities, plus a sprinkling of white liberals. That's not a good way that our politics should be organized. Now, it's true that if you're arguing about ideas, you can also kill each other. That was what the Cold War was about in many ways. And so I'm not saying that ideas are these nice, benign things. Maybe policies would be a better way to describe what I think ought to be, the real basis. I mean, you should argue, do you want higher or lower taxes? Do you want affordable health care? Do you want, infrastructure? I mean, these are the things I think we should be fighting about, rather than thinking in these fixed categories.
Thank you.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between your critique of identity politics on the left and the rise of identity politics on the right. It's a common criticism of identity politics on the left, but I think a lot of people don't say much about what's the connection, how you go from one to the other.
So this is actually one of the areas where I've gotten the most pushback from my book, where a lot of people say, you're blaming all this right-wing, the alt-right and white nationalism on the left, and that's really unfair. You're blaming the victim. And so I guess my response to that is, I'm not blaming anybody, but I do think that there is a causal connection between the two, because, first of all, I think that the right has adopted the identity framing that the left really pioneered and has borrowed it. They use it for less legitimate purposes. White nationalism is not the same thing as Black Lives Matter, so there's no moral equivalence. But they use the same language of victimhood and invisibility and lack of respect and elite, arrogance that was developed by other groups, on the progressive side. And then finally, I really do think that there is a causal connection, just in the sense that it gets back to this political correctness thing, that a lot of the appeal, I think, of some of these conservative groups is that they really don't like the kind of world they see emerging, this identity world that they see emerging, and all the political constraints on what you can say about this and that. And I think that is one of the things that have made people shift over that in that direction. There's lots of other factors as well, so I'm not saying that's the exclusive one, but I do think there is a connection there. Yes.
Thank you for coming out. It seems to me that part of the cause of the polarization and alienation that's been arriving in the last few years is inequality of outcome breeding inequality of opportunity, shutting certain groups, often based on identity, out of the common American or Western identity. Do you believe that purely classical liberal solutions based not on explicit identity categories but on mere citizenship are sufficient to solve this inequality of opportunity based on identity? And if not, is there any way that the liberal state can coexist with explicitly identity-based redistributive policies?
Well, there's a theoretical dimension to that and a practical dimension. The practical dimension is a little bit easier to answer, and it has to do with that question about Singapore that I got earlier. There are a lot of intrusive state social engineering initiatives that could be taken that could try to overcome some of these, like I like the idea of national service. I think that national service is a good idea. And I'm all willing to say it ought to be mandatory, but politically, it's not going to happen in a gazillion years because Americans are just not going to accept that kind of government, compelling them to, give up a year of their lives. Similarly, I think, what we saw with the busing in the 1970s was, it was an attempt to actually force people to live together on the theory that if you actually interacted with people of different races, the racism would decrease. And I think that blew up in everybody's face. I mean, it really actually increased racial animosity, and so it hasn't been really tried since that time. I do think that ultimately, if you want to do what I want to do, which is create a overarching sense of national identity, you can't just leave it up to everybody in their liberal school system, where they can do whatever they want. You do have to be a little bit more directive. You got to teach civics. You've got to make sure that people get something of the same kind of education so that they've got similar sorts of starting points. And again, that runs into a lot of problems in a society committed to individual freedom. So I don't know. I don't know whether that's a theoretical or a practical response. But
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. The question of political leadership came up, and with one of the questioners. And looking at our society, we have such incredible achievements in areas, for example, like science and medicine. Yet political leadership is such a struggle. Is there something about our society, or do you think the task itself is inherently so much more difficult than leadership in other fields?
That's an interesting question because I would never in a million years try to run for president. And I think that we've made that whole process so difficult and unpleasant that it takes a really strange kind of personality to actually want to be president. I forget who it is. I mean, this may go back to Nixon or something. Somebody said, what it takes to become president should automatically disqualify you as president. And by the way, it's not just president. I mean, think what you have to do, be a member of Congress, I mean, spend 90% of your time on the phone with donors. I mean, that doesn't sound like much fun either. So it could be that, in a parliamentary system, particularly if they have closed list voting, you can go from being a university professor to being a member of parliament overnight. A friend of mine did that in Greece because the party just puts you on the party list, and then if they do well in the election, you're in parliament. But in this country, you got to go out and kiss babies and say all these dumb things and call donors and, and so forth. And so a lot of people just don't want to do that. So it probably does reduce the, the pool that you have of available people. Fortunately, there are other parts of the government other than elective office where, that kind of expertise can be useful. But it could be that, it's just harder to recruit competent people to those, very high leadership positions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. I'm a history student, and you and the Professor Dora are my favorite professor regarding the critique of history, whether that's a big H or a small h. And that led me into my research about the tradition versus modernity in China. And so I want to ask you the question that, do you think the China model is a Chinese tradition? And do you think China has politically modernized itself? Thank you.
So, this was really the topic of the first volume of my Political Order series. So I do think that there is a very clear historical basis for the current China model. China has always been a centralized, bureaucratic state that was run in a relatively top-down fashion. And the one thing that China has been really good at ever since the Han Dynasty is bureaucracy, and they continue to be good at it. So I do think that that's a very long-term, continuity. Whether that kind of a system will actually be adequate and sustainable to keep the country going, given how large it is and kind of the stresses that it's likely to encounter, that's a separate issue. But yeah, there certainly is this, I think, long historical continuity. So, in that book, I mentioned this fact that, the Communist Party has first of all, there's a bureaucracy, and then the Communist Party watches over the bureaucracy, and then the disciplinary committee watches over the party, and so you have all these layers. And that's just like in dynastic China, because there you had a bureaucracy, and then you had the eunuch corps that was put there to watch over the bureaucracy, and then you had the eunuch rectification office that watched over the eunuch corps, and so what Chinese government had to do is pile these monitoring organizations one on top of another because you really couldn't trust any of them. And so there's certain, that's another continuity, I think, in the way that, China is governed.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor. I used to study in the Fudan University China Institute for a year, so I watched your debate with my professor Zhang Weiwei. So I want to ask, in debate with Zhang Weiwei, he predicted that in the upcoming years, the United States will elect a president that even worse than George W. Bush. And also he predicted that the Arab winter will Arab Spring will turn into Arab winter. So I want to ask you, so do you think the American values and the liberal revolution process, has been challenged in the modern days? Additionally, do you think the contemporary world is facing the end of the history? Thank you.
So it remains the case that about 2/3 of the countries in the world and about 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that are governed by some form of democracy, right? So I don't think it's a form of government that's about to disappear or on its last legs. And as we speak, you keep getting these revolutions that come out of nowhere. I mean, the latest ones, Nicaragua, Armenia, Malaysia, people get up and say, I don't like this authoritarian government, and, I want more freedom. I want a government that's more responsive, and like I said, a lot of that is about dignity, and so I think that is still, something you should not count out of the picture, because there is this desire really to live in sort of freer society. I mean, in China, all of my Chinese friends are just intensely disappointed with Xi Jinping because they had hoped that he would be a great liberalizer and would give them more, China doesn't have to be a democracy, but at least you could allow people to read what they want and, talk to each other and that sort of thing. And yet, the country's gone in the opposite direction. And I'm not sure that that's actually a choice that would be made, if the Chinese people were actually free to really express their views on how they were to be governed. So, yes.
I appreciate the comments. So I'm just wondering how you would reconcile what you see as the kind of unique threat posed by right-wing identitarianism to American democracy with what seems to me the potency of white supremacy in American politics going back to, before the country's founding and the kind of formation of the idea of a white identity as being like the basis of our, shared American identity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just to pick up on comments you made in response to the question about Singapore, I mean, segregation in the United States was very much the product of social engineering insofar as the federal government and state governments were also very much involved in making that a reality. Does that, undermine it all? What, do you think your
I don't think so,
idea?
Because there's also this progressive story that you can tell about the United States, right? So when the United States was founded, it was a slaveholding society in which slavery was regarded as legitimate by very many people, including in the North. The United States had to fight a civil war in which 600,000 people were killed. And as Lincoln said, I'm going with my students to the Lincoln Memorial immediately after this book signing. But in the second inaugural, he says somehow everybody knew that, this unjust institution was somehow the cause of this war, this terrible war that's consumed the country. It didn't work, the first time after the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, because, people wanted to reunify the country and get the South back in, and they allowed them to impose all these Jim Crow laws to keep blacks down. So that's part of the history, and it took, shamefully another 100 years to fix that. But with each of these movements, you get more freedom. You get, and I am, we're not going to go back to a pre-14th Amendment United States. That's just not going to happen. These white nationalists are not nearly powerful enough or convincing enough that anyone is going to follow them down that path. So I'm very worried. I don't like a lot of the trends right now, but I would not be excessively pessimistic about, the long term, what Obama called the arc of history, right?
Thank you.
Hi. I guess following up on kind of the ever-shifting currents of American power, in my experience, and maybe
Microphone.
Sorry. Well, short for this. In my experience, and maybe I'm being, blinkered by my own identity, the ask of minorities and the oppressed is increased participation in civic life, and that is a threat to the identities or people who have kind of hegemonic control of that. And so in the case of a gay person's desire to get married or buy a cake, that's a request for civic and economic and political participation in a system that is really hegemonically controlled by Christians. And if I was a Christian, I would find that very threatening. And so it seems to me like what we're calling identity politics is the ongoing struggle for empowerment in a system where empowerment means disempowering the people who are in charge. And I wonder how you're supposed to develop an ideas-based civility when the question of power and disempowerment are very real and shifting.
Yeah. So that power dimension is obviously there. And obviously a lot of the backlash, the conservative backlash, is based on people that are unhappy about that. And they don't like the fact that they're losing power. I just think that there is another dimension to that's not the whole story of what's going on the right, that, there's a lot of, let's say, working class rural whites who not only feel disempowered, but they actually are disempowered, right? They don't have a lot of agency. They don't have opportunities in their lives. They're stuck in a little coal mining town in Kentucky. Their families are broken down. They don't have access to education. They don't really have a way of getting out of that situation. So there's a lot of forms of disempowerment, and it does not simply correspond, to race or ethnicity in this country. So that's all I want to say is that, I guess that's what I feel is the problem of using those identity categories as defining, who has power and who doesn't. Because yes, it does correspond to a much greater degree than it should, but it's not the whole story. There are other things going on in this country. If you want to deal with the 99% of the country that is not keeping up with the 1%, a lot of those people are white people. A lot of those people have an opioid crisis, killed 72,000 people last year, more than died in traffic accidents. So there's a social crisis going on, in parts of the population that are not getting respect, not being, paid attention to. And I just think you need to recognize that as well. All right?
All right.
Thank you very much.
Why don't we give another round of applause?